a.m. in the dead of winter, the kind of morning that made even the strongest minds hesitate. The alarm on Ethan's nightstand shrieked, slicing through the silence like a cruel reminder of everything he said he'd start tomorrow. His eyes cracked open to the darkness, the faintest shimmer of dawn hidden beneath thick, gray clouds. The cold was everywhere, crawling under the blanket, biting at his skin, whispering a single, tempting thought: stay in bed. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint hum of the radiator struggling to push warmth into the air. Every fiber of his being wanted to turn over, hit snooze, and disappear back into the comfort of sleep. But deep down, he knew what that comfort really was: a trap disguised as rest, a slow death for every dream he'd ever had. Comfort had been his prison for years, keeping him soft, still, and average. His body begged to stay, but his mind began to fight back. Why do this? He thought. It's too early, it's too cold, it's too much. The excuses lined up perfectly, just as they always did, smooth and convincing. But beneath all that noise came a quieter voice, the one he'd ignored for far too long. It whispered, "Because this sucks. And that's exactly why you need to do it." That one sentence hit harder than the cold. He sat up slowly, the room spinning slightly from the sudden motion. His breath fogged the air. He ran a hand over his face and groaned, not out of pain but defiance. "All right," he muttered to himself, "let's do this." When his feet touched the wooden floor, it was like stepping onto ice. His toes curled against the cold, his muscles shivering in protest. Each step to the bathroom felt heavier than it should have, but he moved anyway, slow, steady, deliberate. The mirror greeted him with a reflection he didn't quite like. His hair was a mess, his eyes tired, his skin pale. He looked ordinary, but deep behind those eyes was a flicker, small, faint, but real. The flicker of someone who was tired of being ordinary. He turned on the tap, and the water came out freezing. For a brief moment, he hesitated. But then he cupped his hands, filled them, and splashed the icy water onto his face. It was shocking, painful, electric. He gasped, wide awake now, heart pounding. The reflection staring back at him looked different, not stronger yet, but alive. Awake, ready. He laced up his running trainers, layered his clothes, and stepped outside into the pre-dawn chill. The world was still asleep. The air was sharp and heavy with frost. The street lamps painted the pavement in a dull orange glow, the silence broken only by the crunch of his shoes against the ground. His breath came out in white clouds as he started to jog. The first few steps were awkward, heavy, uncoordinated. His body screamed, "What are you doing? Go back." But his mind pushed forward, whispering, "Keep going." His hands were numb, his ears burned, and every exhale stung his throat. The cold wind slapped him across the face, reminding him that he could have been warm in bed right now. Yet, there he was, running through the dark, fighting a battle no one else could see. The rhythm of his footsteps slowly found its beat. The pavement stretched endlessly before him, and though his body ached, something strange began to happen. His thoughts quieted. The noise in his head, the doubts, the excuses, the endless chatter, began to fade. All that remained was breath, movement, and the sound of his heart pounding in his chest. He ran past empty shops, fogged windows, and quiet houses where people still slept. Every light he passed felt like a small victory, proof that he was moving when the world wasn't. Each step was defiance, against laziness, against comfort, against the version of himself that always found a reason not to start. By the time he reached the end of the street, his legs were burning. The cold had found its way through every layer, his lungs were on fire, and sweat mixed with the chill to sting his skin. He stopped for a moment, hands on his knees, gasping. He could turn back now, call it a day, tell himself, "I did enough." But that same whisper returned, the one that had dragged him out of bed. "This is the part that sucks. This is the part that matters." He stood up straight, lifted his head, and started running again. This time not just to finish a route, but to prove something to himself. The pain didn't go away, it just stopped feeling like the enemy. It became fuel, proof that he was alive, growing, breaking through the limits he'd built himself. When he finally made it back home, the sky was lighter. The world was waking up. His body was drenched in sweat, his clothes clinging to him, his lungs heaving like a furnace. He leaned against the wall outside his door, letting the cool morning air wash over him. For a few seconds, he just stood there, breathing, heart thundering, face flushed red. He hadn't achieved anything spectacular that morning, no medals, no applause. But inside, something had changed. The same man who'd once hit snooze 10 times had now conquered the first hour of his day. And that victory, small as it looked, meant everything. He walked inside, kicked off his trainers, and caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. This time, he didn't see the tired, ordinary man from before. He saw someone who'd chosen to do what sucked, and because of that, he'd already won the hardest battle there is, the one against himself. He smiled faintly, ran a towel over his face, and whispered under his breath, "This is where it starts." The world outside was still cold, still grey, still hard. But inside him, something had caught fire, something that no winter could put out again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks began to blur into months. The early mornings hadn't gotten any easier. If anything, they'd grown harder. The novelty had worn off, the rush of starting strong had faded. Now, it was just the grind, the slow, unglamorous war of showing up every single day when no one was watching, when no one cared, and when no one cheered. Ethan dragged himself out of bed one dark morning, feeling the soreness deep in his legs. His arms ached from the weights he'd lifted the night before, and his shoulders burned like they'd been carved out of stone. He winced as he stretched. His alarm hadn't even needed to ring anymore. His body was so used to waking before dawn it almost felt cursed. He stared at the running shoes by his door. They looked old now, creased, mud-stained, the white faded to grey. Each mark on them told a story, the miles he'd run when it rained, the mornings he'd nearly given up, the evenings when exhaustion felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. And still, he'd kept going. The world outside was as cold as ever. The sky was a dull sheet of grey, the kind of sky that promised nothing but wind and drizzle. Ethan pulled on his hoodie and stepped out, every step heavier than the last. His breath formed clouds in the air as he began to jog, and the same old thoughts came crawling back, the whispers of doubt, the quiet voice that told him he'd done enough. "This is pointless," it said. "You've already proved yourself. No one's even watching." But that was the point, no one was watching. That's what made it real. Anyone could grind when the world applauded. But doing it alone, without recognition, without validation, that's where the truth lived. The first mile hurt. His calves screamed, his chest tightened, and his feet pounded against the wet pavement in rhythm with his heartbeat. He could have stopped. He could have justified it easily. But deep inside, he knew that the exact moment things started to hurt was the moment that mattered most. That was where growth began. He finished the run and walked home slowly, drenched in sweat, rain mixing with the salt on his skin. His phone buzzed with notifications, messages from friends inviting him out, memes, meaningless chatter. He scrolled through them briefly before switching it off. He didn't have time for distractions anymore. His evenings were the same. The gym was his second home now, echoing music, the clang of iron, the hum of treadmills, the smell of sweat and determination. He pushed through every representative until his muscles shook, until his lungs burned, until the sweat dripped from his chin like rain. Other people came and went, laughing, chatting, taking pictures. But Ethan stayed silent, focused. He wasn't chasing aesthetics or approval, he was chasing something deeper, the version of himself that didn't quit when it sucked. Sometimes, during his final sets, he'd feel like breaking. His arms would tremble so violently that he could barely grip the bar. His head would spin, his vision blur, his body scream to stop. And right there, in that moment of pain, he'd hear that same whisper again, "This is where everyone stops. This is where the weak ones quit. Don't you dare stop here." So he wouldn't. He'd grit his teeth, take a breath, and push again. It didn't look pretty. It wasn't cinematic or heroic. It was ugly, raw, and real. Sweat poured down his face, veins stood out on his arms. But with every lift, every drop of effort, he felt himself hardening, not just his body, but his mind. Outside the gym, life wasn't offering him any mercy either. His boss had started expecting more from him, piling on tasks that stretched him to breaking point. His mates stopped calling as often, tired of hearing him say no to parties, to drinks, to late-night hangouts. Even his parents had started to worry, saying he was taking things too seriously. But they didn't understand. No one did. He wasn't obsessed. He was committed. There's a difference. Late one night, after a brutal training session, Ethan sat on his bed, drenched in sweat. His body throbbed, every muscle pulsing like a heartbeat. The room was silent, except for his own breathing. He looked at the trainers on the floor again, those same worn-out shoes that had carried him through every miserable, freezing morning. He asked himself, why am I doing this? What's the point? And then, from somewhere deep inside, came that same, undeniable truth, because this sucks. Because this pain, this fatigue, this lonely grind, it's the only place where real change happens. Everyone wants the results, few are willing to suffer for them. Ethan realized that he was no longer the man who waited for motivation. He was the man who acted without it. He no longer needed hype videos, or music, or external push. The discipline had become its own reward. The suffering had become familiar, not pleasant, but purposeful. He turned off the light and lay down, his body aching, his mind still sharp. The world outside was still asleep, still comfortable, still dreaming. But Ethan wasn't dreaming anymore, he was doing. And doing always costs more than dreaming. As he closed his eyes, he smiled faintly, despite the pain. He knew something most people never learn: comfort doesn't build character. Struggle does. And the struggle never stops. That's the secret. You don't outgrow the grind, you outgrow your need to escape it. He whispered into the dark, barely loud enough to hear himself, do what sucks. And with that, he drifted to sleep, not content, but hungry for another day of the same pain, the same fight, the same growth. Because this was where he belonged now, in the place that sucks, the place that makes him unbreakable. Months later, the morning sky hung low and heavy over the city. Rain drizzled in a fine mist, clinging to the air like a veil. The kind of weather that made most people stay indoors, tucked under blankets with hot tea. But not Ethan. He stood at the starting line of the half-marathon, shoulders squared, breath slow, eyes fixed ahead. The cold air stung his face, but there was a calmness about him, the kind of calm that comes only from knowing you've already fought the hardest battles before the race even begins. All around him, runners stretched, jogged in place, shook out the nerves. Some chatted nervously, others laughed to mask their anxiety. Ethan didn't speak. He just watched the road stretching out in front of him, wet, uneven, unforgiving. He could almost hear that old whisper again, faint but steady in the back of his mind, do what sucks. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. Runners, get ready. Ethan rolled his shoulders back, took a long breath, and let it out slow. The gun fired, and a wave of bodies surged forward. The sound of hundreds of feet striking wet pavement filled the air like thunder. At first, the run felt almost effortless. His body moved on instinct, rhythm built through months of repetition. His feet found their pace, his lungs adjusted, and his mind fell into that meditative space where the noise of the world faded into nothing but motion. He remembered all those dark mornings, all those freezing runs when no one was watching. This was what they'd been for. Not the medal, not the recognition, the strength to keep moving when everything in him wanted to stop. 5 miles in, the first wave of fatigue hit. His thighs started to burn, and the drizzle turned to rain, soaking through his clothes. The wind picked up, cutting across his face like shards of glass. He could hear people groaning, slowing down, some even stepping aside to rest. The temptation whispered again, just slow down, take it easy, you've done enough. But he smiled through the rain. Enough wasn't in his vocabulary anymore. Come on, he muttered under his breath. Do what sucks. And he did. The road climbed uphill, cruel and steep. Each step felt like lifting bricks with his legs. His breath came out in ragged gasps, his chest tightening, his calves screaming. But he refused to stop. He kept his eyes on the crest of the hill, repeating the same 3 words over and over, do what sucks. By mile 10, his body was in open rebellion. His lungs burned, his shoulders slumped, and his legs felt like lead. But deep inside, something else had taken over, something fierce, unbreakable. The part of him that had woken up at 5 a.m. in the dark, that had run in the rain, that had trained when no one cared, that part was in control now. Pain wasn't the enemy anymore, it was the signal that he was alive, that he was growing, that he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. Spectators lined the streets near the final stretch, clapping and cheering. Ethan barely heard them. His focus was tunneled, his vision locked on the finish line in the distance, that simple strip of tape that represented months of suffering, sacrifice, and self-discipline. Every inch of his body screamed to stop, but his spirit roared louder. With one final push, he sprinted. It wasn't fast, it wasn't graceful, but it was everything he had. His shoes splashed through puddles, his breath came out like fire, and when he crossed that line, his whole body trembled. He didn't raise his arms or shout in triumph. He just slowed to a walk, letting the rain wash the salt and sweat from his face. He'd done it, not for a medal, not for the crowd, but for himself. He'd faced the hardest version of the journey, the one that demanded everything and gave nothing but pain in return, and he'd won. He stopped, hands on his hips, eyes closed. His chest heaved, and for a moment, all he could hear was the rain falling around him. He wasn't thinking about the distance or the time. He was thinking about the man he used to be, the one who hit snooze, who made excuses, who lived for comfort. That man was gone now, burned away in the fire of repetition, discomfort, and grit. Ethan opened his eyes and looked up at the sky. The rain hadn't stopped, but it didn't matter anymore. The pain in his legs, the ache in his lungs, the exhaustion in his bones, it all felt like proof. Proof that he'd finally understood what strength really was. He whispered, half to himself, half to the storm, "Do what sucks. That's how you rise." And as he walked away from the finish line, soaked, exhausted, and unshakably calm, he knew that life would never get easier, but he would always be strong enough to face it.